This is the third interview in a series of 4 interviews with Brian Livingston, who's an executive fellow with the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. He's written a 4-part intelligent memo for CD Howe on Canadian emissions. So I'm going to talk to him about that. Welcome to the interview, Brian.
Nice to be here, Markham.
Now, we've done oil and gas, we've done transportation. This one is all about buildings. And can you give us maybe just a brief overview of your analysis here, please?
Happy to. Buildings comprise about 91 million tons of emissions, which is give or take about, say 12% of total Canadian emissions. And they're broken into 3 categories. One is residential buildings, the ones that we live in, whether they be semi-detached, detached, or condo and apartments, or even mobile homes. There's about 43 million tons for that. There's 33 million tons for commercial buildings, the office buildings, the schools, the hospitals, things like that. And there's 15 million tons for industrial buildings. Those are things like steel mills and car manufacturing plants and things like that. You total that up, and that means today, as we speak, there's about the 91 million. The target that the government has set to reduce by 2030 is about 53 million tons. So you can see that's about a 40% reduction.
And the assumption here is that heat pumps will replace a lot of the natural gas and heating oil that's used across the country. And I'm particularly interested in this because in last spring, we replaced our natural gas furnace with a heat pump. And 2 observations. One, in our climate on Vancouver Island, which is more temperate than, say, the prairies and even Eastern Canada, it's fantastic. We air conditioning in the summer, heat in the winter. It's comfortable. It's quite economic, and but it wasn't cheap either. That's the second one. We had to increase the electrical supply to our house. That was about $4,000. We ran into some other issues, and it probably came in at about $15,000 to $18,000 at the end of the day. And I wonder, we're doing it about 20,000 heat pump installations per year in Canada. The upfront cost has got to be an explanation for why that number is so low.
Yes, and the government has tried several things. They have a $5,000 what they call green housing grant for people who want to put a heat pump into their building. The way I look at it, retrofits are more difficult than new builds. It's easier to put a heat pump into a newly built unit than it is to put it into a retrofit. And they've also had programs for commercial buildings, which form a significant portion of emissions as well, to put a 30% investment tax credit. And I think that was, if I recall, the last budget in November of this past year. And that's to encourage commercial and industrial buildings to put heat pumps in. But you're right, the capacity for heat pumps is the amount of heat pumps they need is just immense. A colleague of mine, Charles DeLand at the CD Howe Institute, said, you're going to need to do, and Pembina Institute has done this as well. You're going to need to put in 600,000 heat pumps a year in order to convert the residential buildings, and further a huge amount to convert commercial buildings. And given we've only had 20,000 per year historically, and that's in my presentation, that's a huge, huge change to get people to make the change that you've described, not to mention that it does cost money, not only for the heat pump itself, but also for the electrical wiring and installation. You've got to pay the trades to come in, and they probably took 2 or 3 days, if I could suggest Markham or guess Markham, to do it in your house. Now you're somebody who's done it, and to be candid, Vancouver Island, the climate is perfect for heat pumps because it's not that cold. It's a little bit different if you're in Kelowna or Timmins or someplace where it goes to minus 30 Celsius, because heat pumps, and this is the engineer in me talking, heat pumps lose their efficiency the colder it is outside. It takes more energy to pump the heat from the outside cold environment into the inside warmer environment of your house.
Indeed. And I've done an interview with NRCan, National Resources of Canada scientists. There are generations of cold weather heat pumps coming, but this is still fairly new technology, and it's not common in Canada yet by any stretch. Now, so we've got 600,000 heat pumps that need to be installed to get to the climate targets in 2030, only 20,000. So there's a problem with supply of heat pumps, and this jives with what we found in the spring. We called up various contractors to get quotes, and many of them were 6 to 12 months just to get the heat pumps. And some came from Japan, some came from China. We found a company that sourced an American firm that makes them, so we managed to get them in a timely fashion. But just getting heat pumps to supply the 20,000 a year seems to be a problem. Gearing up and finding 580,000 more heat pumps in a year seems like a very difficult task.
Well, if you go back to the session we did on electric vehicles, the analogy is very clear in two ways. First, we've got a supply issue. What you're describing is there's a supply issue. I mean, whether or not we can get people to demand and be ready to put heat pumps into their existing buildings, we have a supply issue as whether we can build them. The second one is we have a fleet of about 10 million buildings, 10 million residential units, both houses and condominium units and apartments, that are still heated by natural gas or heating oil, a little bit of wood as well. And so to get all those people to convert will take time, and it'll take time to turn over the fleet in the same way it takes time to turn over the fleet of electric vehicles.
Right. And the 6 million that are heated by electricity, they're using resistance heat. The same problems apply. You still have the capital costs. You've got to renovate those houses and install the heat pumps. Now, what about new construction? You're assuming that there are 250,000 new homes every year, and your point is that we can barely make enough heat pumps and get them supplied to service the new construction that's coming onto the market, never mind doing the retrofits.
Exactly. I believe the city of Vancouver has said that any houses, residential units built after 2022 cannot be heated by natural gas or home heat oil. They have to be heated by heat pumps. Now, I believe, and I'm going from memory here, that's about 1,000 new units in Vancouver a year. 1,000 you can do. I mean, it's just like ZEV mandates for cars. You can put the equivalent mandates for houses, for new houses, but you still need 250,000 across the country in order to make all those new builds to use heat pumps. Building codes, which is what you're talking about, if you're talking about requiring heat pumps in buildings, are provincial matters. As a lawyer in me says, constitutionally, that's a provincial matter, not a federal matter. The feds can put out, as they have, and say, look, we'll give you $5,000 if you convert to a heat pump, just like you have, but they cannot mandate building codes because those are provincial matters. So the feds are trying, as I understand it, to get a national type building code in the same way they almost do it for healthcare, where they have kind of certain parameters that have to be in healthcare, where they say we should have certain parameters that be in building codes as well. How far along that's come, you'd have to ask them. They're trying, but they've got a very steep hill to climb. And my paper goes through and does the numbers. It calculates how many buildings there are. It goes into the NRCan data. I had to do a lot of research to get how many buildings there are and how much commercial real estate there is, and makes a realistic assessment of how many heat pumps will go in the next 8 years between now and 2030. I actually assumed an increase of 25% because of the incentives I described, the $5,000 per person for houses and condos, and also the ITC for investment tax credit for commercial. And I still said you only get to about 230,000 heat pumps per year in the year 2030. And that's going from 20,000, as you just said now. So even with all that work, you're still going to come short of how many of your target that the federal government. And just to give some specific numbers, for residential units, the target was about 25 million tons, down from the 43. My calculations, I'm looking like this because I've got it written down. My calculation, they're only going to get down to about 42. They're going to hardly decrease at all. And that's even assuming that buildings like residential buildings become better because people have better seals in their windows and they have better insulations and so on. For commercial, it's going to go from 35 to 33, and that was versus the target of 18. And for industrial, it'll go from 15 to 13 versus the target of 10. You total all that up, total all those numbers up. The bottom line is the 91 million, instead of going to the target of 53, is only going to go to a forecast of 86. So you're going to have a shortfall there. And again, all these numbers, there are charts that I have in my presentation that's on the CD Howe website.
Yes, and for viewers and listeners, we'll be linking to that presentation in both the YouTube description and in the podcast show notes. So you can find the link there and check it out if you'd like to look at the issue in more detail. Now, one of the points that you make is that in 2030, heat pumps are only going to heat about 7% of the 750 million square meters of commercial space.
Correct.
That's a very, very small percentage. One of the things I've run across in the United States, you see it a little bit in Canada, but more in the US on public buildings, commercial buildings, and that is energy as a service. And so let's say that you're a school board that has 10 schools. The company comes in, it does an energy audit, it comes back to you with a plan, and it says, we're going to retrofit your schools to make them more energy efficient. We're going to put in heat pumps, we're going to put in solar panels, and then we'll pay the capital cost, and we'll get paid back on that and make money on the saving on your energy savings. So it doesn't cost the school board anything extra, maybe a little bit extra, but it seems to be a fairly efficient model. And I wonder, Brian, what you think of some of those innovative models like energy as a service to speed up the adoption of heat pumps and get maybe meet the 2030 targets, or at least get a lot closer to them.
Well, the entrepreneurial spirit is alive and well in this country. You've described a need. I'm actually doing a seminar on entrepreneurs for the University of Law School I went to. And the mantra I always say is find a need and fill it. And you're in essence saying maybe there's a need out there that schools have that say, look, we don't really have a lot of money to put in for new capital investment. If you'll do the capital investment and take the money back in the savings, and that's how you, the entrepreneur, will find the economic opportunity to put in heat pumps and so on in our school, then we'll let you come in and do our school. That's a good observation. If I were in the environment ministry, either federally or provincially, I would listen to you, and then I would go out and try to find people who do this, and then I would try to get those people together with all the commercial buildings, whether they be schools, hospitals, office buildings, warehouses, which is what commercial buildings are.
Brian, any final observations on emissions from buildings in Canada? I guess I have one question is, what are the odds that we actually miss the target by even more than your estimates? I mean, fair to say that in some cases you've been fairly generous with your assumptions about how much heat pump adoption will grow. But is there not a real threat here that we might even miss it by a larger amount?
Well, if you look historically, and I show some of the historical numbers, the emissions from residential buildings have been flat to down a bit, probably because people are building houses with better insulation and better windows and so on. The emissions from commercial has been going up a little bit, probably because there's more commercial space coming online, and especially in industrial space as well. So the answer is, yeah, you could always, you're asking me what my boss used to ask me about, Brian, is that an over or under number? What's your over under number? And would you bet over or under on the number you put out? I would probably be pretty close to neutral, to be candid, to answer your question. I don't think it's going to be over. I don't think it's going to be under much. And the only way it'll change is if the government says, listen, we got to make heat pumps a key indicator of what we're doing. And we've got to have somebody designated at a high level in the governments to say, we need thousands and even millions of heat pumps in the next 8 years. That would be, to use a term that I learned, a key dashboard indicator, because that's a key number that will determine what the emissions from buildings will be.
Well, just for viewers and listeners, the finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, has promised more details on what she calls real muscular industrial policy. And one can see how the manufacturer, setting up or stimulating the manufacture of more heat pumps in Canada could happen using federal industrial policy. And we'll be here at Energy Media, we'll be doing a fair amount of work in 2023 on what industrial policy in the clean energy space means. So watch for that. Brian, thank you very much for this. We'll look forward to the fourth interview.
Thanks very much, Markham.